you think that you lost? Oh, I will take your hand and we'll rise up from the dust. Oh, here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We all have our reasons why we are on this track. Oh, we all have our burdens, yeah, but we just keep on fighting and we never look back. Here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne.
Okay, good evening. It is time to get into another couple of chapters of the Secret History of the World. So, our first chapter tonight is chapter 12, The Descent into Darkness, Moses and the Kabbalah. Bullet pointed again, so it's multiple subjects here. Akhenaten and Satan, Solomon, Sheba, and Hiram, and King Arthur and the Crown Chakra are the subjects for this chapter. So, jump right on into it here. Egyptian civilization is perhaps the most successful in recorded history, lasting over 3,000 years. Compare this with European, American, Christian civilization, which has so far lasted only about 2,000 years. Another notable thing in Egypt's extraordinarily well-preserved historical records, which have survived on temple walls, on tablets, and in papyri. These have been vital in placing neighboring civilizations that have left less complete records and remains in a chronological context. The exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt has traditionally been placed in the reign of the pharaoh Ramses II, one of the greatest and most expansive rulers of Egypt, a great builder at Luxor and Abu Simbel. His monuments also include the gigantic obelisk currently standing in La Place de la Concorde in Paris. In the Romantic poet Shelley's Ozymandias, he became the archetype of the earthly ruler who comes to believe his achievements will last forever. Quote, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," end quote. A worthy opponent for Moses, you might think. Cecil B. DeMille certainly thought so, but a problem has arisen. Archaeologists discovered that if you look for traces of the Hebrews in the reign of Ramses II, or if you look, for example, for traces of the fall of Jericho or the Temple of Solomon in the corresponding archaeological layers, you find absolutely nothing. This led to a consensus among academics that the epic myths of the origins of the Jews were just myths, quote unquote, in the sense that they had no basis in historical reality. Is it worth pausing for a moment to wonder how much these people wanted the stories to be untrue, how much their convictions were informed by a sort of adolescent glee at the nursery certainties being overturned? In the 1990s, a group of younger archaeologists based in Austria and London and led by David Rohl began to question the conventional chronology of Egypt. More particularly, they came to realize that in the period of the Third Intermediate Dynasty, two king lists, which had been understood to run one after the other, should really be understood as running concurrently. This had the effect of shortening the chronology of ancient Egypt by approximately 400 years. Known as the New Chronology, it is gradually gaining ground even among the older generation of Egyptologists. An incidental side effect of the new chronology, I say incidental because these scholars have no religious axe to grind, was that when field archaeologists began to search for traces of the biblical stories some 400 years earlier, they made sensational discoveries. The human condition gives us, I hate that term, the human condition. The human condition gives us extraordinary latitude for believing what we want to believe, but for anyone who does not have a strong ulterior motive for believing that the biblical stories are just fairy tales, quote unquote, this new evidence is quite compelling. It shows that Moses did not live in about 1250 BC, contemporary with Ramses II. Instead, he was born in about 1540 BC, and the Exodus took place in approximately 1447 BC. Using astronomical retrocalculations, Venus observations recorded in Mesopotamian texts that cross-reference both the Bible and also surviving Egyptian records, David Rohl has provided strong evidence to show that Moses was brought up an Egyptian prince in the reign of Neferhotep I in the mid-16th century BC. Rohl has found complementary evidence in an account by Artapanus, a Jewish historian of the 3rd century BC, who may well have had access to now lost records from the Egyptian temples. Artapanus related how Prince Mousos, he has it spelled Mousos, became a popular administrator under Khenephr's Neferhotep I's successor. Mousos was sent. Okay, that's got to be a typo. So Moses then was sent into exile when the Pharaoh became jealous of him. Finally, Rohl has shown that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Khenephr's successor, Dudimos. Excavations in the Dudimos level have revealed the remains of a foreign settlement of slaves or workers, such as are also referred to in the Brooklyn Papyrus, a royal decree authorizing transfer of just such a group at just this time. This settlement may have been built for and by the Hebrews. There are also death pits and evidence of hasty mass burials which may be traces of the biblical plagues. Unearthing stone remains may ground us in historical reality, but in order to understand what was really important in human terms, what it felt like to be there, the highest and deepest that human experience had to offer, we must turn again to the secret tradition. As an Egyptian prince, Moses was initiated in the Egyptian mysteries. This is recorded by the Egyptian historian Manetho, who identified Heliopolis as the mystery school. It is confirmed in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, where the apostle Stephen says, quote, "And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians," end quote. The teachings of Moses are steeped in Egyptian wisdom. For example, spell 125 in the Book of the Dead describes the judgment of the dead. The spirit is required to declare to Osiris that he has led a good life, then deny having committed a list of specific immoral acts to the 42 judges of the dead. Quote, "I have not robbed, I have not killed, I have not borne false witness," and so on. End quote, and so on. Of course, this predates the Ten Commandments. It is no denigration of Moses to point this out. His teaching could not have done otherwise than grow out of the given historical milieu. What is historically significant about Moses is the way he reframed the ancient wisdom with the aim of leading humankind into the next stage of the evolution of consciousness. When Moses fled into exile in the desert, he encountered a wise old teacher. Jethro was an African, Ethiopian high priest, keeper of a library of stone tablets. When Moses married his daughter, Jethro initiated him to a higher level. This is what is being alluded to in the story of the burning bush. When Moses saw the burning bush not being consumed by the fire, this was a vision of the self that is not destroyed by the purging fire that awaits on the other side of the grave. A sense of mission arose out of Moses' vision of the burning bush, an impulse to work for the greater good of humanity, to lead us all to a land flowing with milk and honey. But then, as Moses hesitated before the magnitude of the task in front of him, God stiffened his resolve. Quote, "And thou shalt take this rod in thy hand, wherewith thou shalt do signs." End quote. As Moses journeyed back to Egypt, he intended to ask the Pharaoh to, quote, "set my people free," end quote. As Moses and his brother Aaron stood in the throne room, Aaron suddenly threw his rod to the ground. It changed magically into a snake. The Pharaoh ordered his court magicians to match this feat, but as they did so, Aaron's snake swallowed theirs. As the battle of wills between Moses and the Pharaoh unfolded, Moses used his own rod, or wand, to direct the course of events, to bring fire and hail down from the sky, to bring on a plague of locusts, to part the Red Sea, to strike a rock to cause water to gush out of it. What does this mean? I suspect many readers may be well ahead of me already, but the folk legend that this rod was carved out of wood that originally came from the tree in the Garden of Eden points to its deeper meaning. The rod is part of the vegetable dimension of the cosmos. By mastering it and manipulating it as it runs through his own body, Moses, now an adept, was also able to master and manipulate the cosmos around him. Later, after Moses had given up trying to persuade the Pharaoh to set his people free and had led them out into the Sinai desert, he came down from the mountain with the tablets of stone. Moses proved to be a hard taskmaster, in some ways harder than the Pharaoh's. Again and again his people failed to live up to his demands. At one point they were punished by a plague of fiery and deadly serpents. Numbers chapter 7 verse 19. To save them, Moses nailed a bronze serpent across a raised horizontal pole. In John chapter 3 verse 14 comments on his passage in the Old Testament, quote, "And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up," end quote. Clearly, John is seeing the bronze serpent as foreshadowing the crucified Jesus Christ. Quote, "lifted up," quote unquote, carries with it a sense of being transformed or transfigured. The bronze serpent has been smelted and so looks forward, John suggests, to the transfiguration of the material body of humanity. The rod that Moses used to smite the Egyptians and to discipline his own people was an image of the Lucifer serpent of animal consciousness that has been straightened and subdued by willpower and a moral discipline that is very hard to maintain. The great gift Moses gave his people then was guilt. Morality emerges into history with Moses and with it a call to a change of heart. If we look at the Ten Commandments from I am just not doing good today. If we look at the Ten Commandments from the perspective of the esoteric doctrine, what is most significant is the way that the first two commandments banned the use of images in religious practice and called upon the Jews to worship no other gods. Following Abraham, Moses was working towards a new kind of religion that did away with the practices of older religions with their elaborate, overwhelming ceremonies, the loud clashing cymbals, the blinding clouds of smoke, and speaking idols. The old religion aimed to diminish consciousness. The worshippers would attain access to the spirit worlds, but in an uncontrolled way. In the great, overwhelming, and riotous visions of the followers of Osiris. It was this that Moses was concerned to roll back and replace with a thoughtful, more conscious communion with the divine. By this ban on images, Moses was helping to create the conditions that would make abstract thought possible. The Ten Commandments and the other laws of Exodus and Deuteronomy form Moses' public teaching. They are for all the people. In esoteric tradition, he also taught 70 elders, the Kabbalah, the secret mystical teachings of Judaism at the same time. The Kabbalah is as broad a church as a major world religion, and we will be returning to different aspects of it. Okay, and then we've got a couple of pictures, three pictures. The first one is the Ujjayi as a series of fractions. Interesting. Okay, well I'll have to blow it up a little bit here for you to be able to read it. The Ujjayi. So 8th, half, quarter, 16th, 32nd, 64th. Okay. I wonder how they came to that conclusion. Maybe we'll see here in a minute. Okay, the next two pictures are going to come up together, and there's quite a long caption for them. I'll read first. In sacred idealism, the human form is a microcosm of the universe. The divine proportions can be found not just in ammonites and nebulae, but also in the human body. The renegade Egyptologist R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz spent 15 years on site tracing the divine mathematical proportions of the Temple of Luxor. He showed how the ritual laying of the foundation and consecration of the temple was called the ceremony of giving the house to its master. Likewise, in Hinduism, he wrote, the building of a temple in the form of a human body was a magical process. It was believed that if the overseer of the work of building a temple had made a mistake in the construction of a particular part of a temple, he would suffer an illness or injury in the corresponding part of his own body. Okay, so we'll bring up those two pictures. Okay, so I'm assuming what he means by some of that is that these are, like this outline, obviously, is a temple of some kind. And then this one, these lines he has superimposed over this body, is another temple. Okay. Again, it is no denigration of Moses or the Kabbalah to point out that it grew out of an older tradition, the mystical number system of the Egyptians. Reams of mathematical calculations have not come down to us from ancient Egypt, but their understanding of higher mathematics has survived in Egyptian art. For example, the Eye of Horus was often represented as the Ujjayi, which we now know was made up of a number of hieroglyphs representing fractions which add up to a total of 63/64. Okay. I'm not going to do that math right at the moment, but it kind of just off the top of my head looks like he's maybe onto something there. Yeah, I think he's right there. Okay. I'm sure he is. I'm sure he checked his own math. Um, if you reverse this and divide 64 by 63, you come up with what has been called the greatest secret of the Egyptians, a number called the comma of Pythagoras. Highly complex numbers like the comma of Pythagoras, pi and phi, sometimes called the golden proportion, are known as irrational numbers. They lie deep in the structure of the physical universe and were seen by the Egyptians as the principles controlling creation, the principles by which matter is precipitated from the cosmic mind. Nambro, hello. Good evening to you, sir. Good to see you. That would be pi to the I don't even know how many digits that would be. I wonder how far out the Egyptians or Pythagoras figured pi. I'd be curious. Um, Known as irrational numbers, cosmic mind. Okay. Today, scientists recognize that the comma of Pythagoras, pi, and the golden proportion, phi, as well as the closely related Fibonacci sequence, are universal constants that describe complex patterns in astronomy, music, and physics. For example, the Fibonacci sequence is a series in which each number is the sum of the two preceding it. Spirals are built up according to this sequence. It is rampant in nature in the spirals of galaxies, the shape of ammonites, and the arrangement of leaves on a stem. Conch shells, too, I think. The Google to the Google. Yes, Google knows all, or at least it wants us to believe it does. To the Egyptians, these numbers were also the secret harmonies. I totally lost my place. To the Egyptians, these numbers were also the secret harmonies of the cosmos, and they incorporated them as rhythms and proportions in the construction of their pyramids and temples. A building made in this way would be ideal. A hall, a doorway, a window, which had the golden proportion built into it, would be ineffably pleasing to the human spirit. The great temples of Egypt are, of course, bursting with vegetable forms, such as the bulrush shaped pillars of the great. I know I'm probably not pronouncing this right, hypostyle at Karnak. But it was the vegetable life that gives proportion to human limb, the vegetable life that turns ribs and makes them curve according to a pleasing mathematical formula that the temple builders were particularly concerned to reproduce. The point is that Egyptian temples were built in this way because the gods were no longer able to inhabit bodies of flesh and blood. A temple was built to be the body of a god, no less. The god's spirit lived inside the vegetable and material bodies that the temple embodied, such just as the human spirit lives inside its vegetable and material bodies. Okay, and that actually reminds me of something. God's not having bodies of flesh and blood. Um, I heard an interesting theory today about how the we've been told that the ancient gods, Mercury and Venus and so on, Mars, were associated with the planets. And this guy's theory was that they were the planets, and that they abandoned their physical bodies, brought their souls down to Earth to inhabit human form, um, and that's why these celestial bodies are these permanent things, but yet they're soulless now. It was just kind of an interesting. I'd have to actually listen to the guy's video again to get his whole theory, but it was interesting. Okay, so we've got another picture, and this is that hypostyle hall at Karnak. So let me bring that up. So I've actually never heard this term, this hypostyle. Um, if I'm probably butchering it. But I recognize these pillars from other pictures I've seen with this flared top. But anyway, that's the picture. Moving on. The Hebrews have not left a rich architectural heritage like the Egyptians. Their number their number mysticism has come down to us encoded in the language of the books of Moses. The great book of the Kabbalah is the Zohar, which is a vast commentary on the first 5 books of the Old Testament, traditionally ascribed to Moses. If the world is materialized thought, then according to the Kabbalah, words and letters were the means by which this process happened. God created the world by manipulating and making patterns out of the Hebrew letters of the alphabet. Hebrew letters, therefore, have magical properties, and the patterns they make in Scripture open up layers, indeed vistas, of hidden meaning. Which reminds me of another thing. I have a book called The Bible Code that I would like to read on this stream at some point. So after I finish this book, if your vote is for the Bible Code, I will make it next. All right. Bible Code is pretty interesting. I think it would be. I would really like to. That's why I've held on to the book, to the physical book. I didn't get rid of the hard copy. I don't. I hope. I hope I kept it. Nope, there it is, right there. Because I wanted to that seems like a book I really need to go through the physical copy of. I don't know why. It just does. Um, but I think it would be very interesting, and I'd like to do it. Exodus chapter 14 contains 3 verses, 19, 20, and 21, which each consist of 72 letters. If you write these verses on top of one another so that the 72 letters appear in columns, then reading a column at a time, you will discover the secret 72 names of God. Each Hebrew letter is also a number. Aleph, the Hebrew A, is 1, Beth is 2, and so on. There are complex connections here. The Hebrew word for father has a numerical value of 3, and the word for mother has a value of 41. The Hebrew word for child is 44, the combination of mother and father. Interesting, yeah. It gets more mind-blowing. The numerical value of the Hebrew phrase for the Garden of Eden is 144. The numerical value of the Tree of Knowledge is 233. If you divide 233 by 144, you get very close to 4 decimal points. You get very close to 4 decimal points to the value to the golden ratio phi. In the last few decades, mathematicians have applied themselves to the task of finding messages encoded in the texts of the books of Moses. Breakthrough work by Whitstone, Rips, and Rosenberg aimed at discovering transcription codes using equidistant letter sequences. The published results include some names of post-biblical historical figures from Hebrew history, but as yet no propositions, no sequences of sentences, or anything that could be read as a message. Again, it is not my secret to reveal, but one Cambridge-based statistician has shown me the results of applying an extremely complex skip code, a code verified as valid by a Cambridge University professor of mathematics. The fragments he showed me were reminiscent of the Psalms. Imagine if a whole other book or series of books were encoded in the text we have. Would each of these texts have different layers of meaning too? Each one, e- uh, Such an achievement is beyond the capacity of normal human intelligence. Recent research by an occult group has shown that J.S. Bach composed some of the world's most beautiful melodies, such as the famous, I'm going to butcher this, Chacone, 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 while at the same time giving each note the value of a letter of the alphabet. Bach's music spells music. Bach's music spells out secret psalm-like messages. This again is surely something beyond normal human intelligence. In esoteric circles, language which is imbued by initiates with layers of meaning is sometimes called the green language or language of the birds. Rabelais, I guess, Rabelais, and Nostradamus, contemporaries at Montpellier University, as well as Shakespeare, are all said to have written it. Wagner refers to it when he alludes to the tradition that Siegfried learned the language of the birds by drinking dragon's blood. One last possibility while we're still on this topic. Perhaps we all speak the green language all the time. Perhaps the only difference between us and the great initiates, like Shakespeare, is that they do it consciously. Sigmund Freud was deeply interested in the Kabbalah, as we will see. It was a formative influence on his thought, but he got hold of the wrong end of the stick when he argued that the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten was the source of Moses' monotheism. He now We now know Moses came first. Akhenaten's ideas of monotheism were subtly but dangerously different. At the height of the Egyptian New Kingdom, the reign of Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, seemed to signal a new era of even greater peace and prosperity, which, even if it didn't match the unique achievement of the Great Pyramid, would see the construction of the most magnificent temples of the ancient world. After the birth of three daughters, Queen Tai, Tiy, I don't know how, gave Amenhotep a son, perhaps because he had been long awaited, perhaps partly because it was clear his father did not have long to live. The boy who was to become Akhenaten was brought up inside the temple precincts and grew up with a sense of cosmic mission. Akhenaten had been born with a chromosomal defect that gave him a strange, hermaphroditic, even unearthly appearance, womanly thighs and an elongated face that might be read as ethereal, even spiritual. This defect can also lead to symptoms of mental instability, mania, delusions, paranoia. Some combination of these factors may have contributed to his actions, which threatened to disrupt the whole progress of human evolution. Unlike in Babylon, where kings acted independently of the priesthood, leading to extremes of despotic cruelty, the pharaohs of Egypt ruled under the aegis of the initiate priests. This is why the popular view of Akhenaten's revolution that sees it as an act of radical individualism is quite wrong. The start of Akhenaten's reign coincided with the beginning of a Sothic cycle. This was one of the greatest of the astronomical cycles that shaped history according to the priestly theology. The Sothic cycle is 1460 years long. In Egyptian mythology, each new beginning of this cycle saw the return of the Bennu bird, the phoenix heralding the birth of the new age and a new dispensation. When Akhenaten announced the closing of the most magnificent temple in the world at Karnak and the founding of a new cult center and capital city approximately halfway between Karnak and Giza, this was not the willful act of an eccentric individual, but an initiate king acting out cosmic destiny. He was preparing to welcome the return of the Bennu bird in 1321 BC. His first act was to build a new temple to Aten, the god of the sun disk. In the great courtyard of Akhenaten's new temple was its centerpiece, an obelisk topped by the Benben stone of which the legendary phoenix was to alight. On which the legendary phoenix. His next act, supported by his mother queen Tai, was to build his great new capital city and sail the whole machinery of government down to it on barges. He wanted to shift the earth on its axis. He then declared that all other gods did not really exist and that Aten was the one true and only God. This was monotheism in something very like the modern sense, the worship of Osiris, Isis, and Amun-Re. Okay, never seen it written that way. No, I have seen it written that way. Amun-Re, it's R-E instead of R-A, was forbidden. Their temples were effaced and shut down, and their popular festivals declared superstitions. There is something appealing to modern sensibility about Akhenaten's reforms. Like today's monotheism, Akhenaten's was materialistic. By definition, monotheism does away with other gods, and it tends to do away with other spirits and other forms of disembodied intelligence, too. Which is why I've always had questions about Catholicism. So monotheism tends to be materialistic in the sense that it tends to deny the experience of spirits, and that experience, as we have already said, is what spirituality really is. So it was the physical sun that Akhenaten declared divine and the source of all goodness. As a result, the art of Akhenaten's reign did away with the hieratic formalism of the traditional Egyptian art with its ranks of deities. Akhenaten's art seems naturalistic in a way we find easy to appreciate. Some of his beautiful hymns to Aten have survived, and they seem remarkably to anticipate the Psalms of David. Quote, "How manifold is that which you have made! You created the world according to your desire, all men, cattle, and wild animals." End quote, declaimed Akhenaten. Quote, "How countless are your works!" sang David. "You made all of them so wisely, the world is full of your creatures." End quote. But behind the poetry, behind all the clean intelligence and modernism, there lurked monomaniacal madness. By banning all the other gods and declaring himself the only channel for the wisdom and influence of Aten on earth, he was in effect making the whole priesthood redundant and replacing them with just himself. But despite making himself the focus of all religious practice, he withdrew deeper and deeper into the maze of courtyards of his palace with his beautiful wife Nefertiti and their beloved children. He played with his young family, composed hymns, and refused to hear any bad news regarding unrest among the people or of the rebellions in Egypt's colonies that threatened its supremacy in the region. Collapse eventually came from within. 15 years into his reign, the daughter on whom he doted died, despite all his prayers to Aten. Then his mother, Tai, who had always supported him, died too. Nefertiti disappears from court records. 2 years later, the priests had Akhenaten killed, and they put on the throne the young boy who was to become known to the world as Tutankhamun. Immediately, the priests set about restoring Thebes. Akhenaten's capital quickly became a ghost town, and every monument to him, every depiction of him, every mention of the name of Akhenaten was ruthlessly ruthlessly and systematically effaced. Some modern commentators have seen Akhenaten as a prophetic, even saintly figure. It is significant, though, that as we know from Manetho, the Egyptians remembered his reign as a Sethian event. Seth is, of course, Satan, the great spirit of materialism who always works to destroy true spirituality. If his envoy Akhenaten had successfully converted humankind to materialism, then the 3,000 years of the gentle, beautiful growth of the human spirit and many qualities that had evolved since would have been lost forever. Although it may not have survived in anything like the same state of preservation as some of the Egyptian temples, no temple looms larger in the collective imagination than the Temple of Solomon. Saul was Saul has recently been identified as a historical figure who features in the letters of kings subject to Akhenaten. They loyally wrote to him with reports of local events. Saul's name in these letters is Labia, the queen of the Habiru. Following these identifications in the records of neighboring cultures, we may now say with confidence that David Tadua became the first to unite the tribes of Israel in one kingdom when he became king of Jerusalem in 1004 BC, which is to say in the reign of Tutankhamun. David laid the foundations of a temple at Jerusalem but died before he could build it, and so this task was left to his son, whom we now know was anointed king of Jerusalem in 971 BC. Before the advances made by David Roll's new chronology, it had been believed that Solomon, if he was a real historical figure at all, lived in the Iron Age. This was a big problem because archaeology could find in the remains of that period no evidence of the wealth and building projects for which Solomon has always been famous. Relocating Solomon into the late Bronze Age has proved to be a perfect fit. The remains of Phoenician-style architecture that a Hiram might have built have been dug up in the appropriate strata. The figure of Solomon glows in the popular imagination as the embodiment of all manly magnificence. Sorry, where did I get manly? All kingly magnificence and wisdom, and in the secret tradition as the magical controller of demons. In the secret in the secret traditions of Freemasonry, as we know from an oration by Chevalier Michael Ramsay in 1736, Solomon recorded his magical knowledge in a secret book which was later laid in the foundations of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. In Jewish folklore, Solomon's reign was so splendid that gold and silver became as common as stones in the street. But because the Jews had no tradition of building temples up to this time, having been a nomadic people, Solomon chose to employ as architect for this project a Phoenician, Hiram Abif. If the building seems If the building seems, on the evidence of the measurements given in the Old Testament, no larger than a parish church, it was nevertheless crammed with ornamentation of unparalleled magnificence. In its middle stood the Holy of Holies, lined with gold plate and encrusted with jewels. It was designed to contain the Ark of the Covenant, containing the tablets of Moses. The cherubim, whose wings stretched protectively over it, were, as we have seen, representatives of constellations of the zodiac belt. On the corners of the altar stood 4 horns, representing the moon, and a golden candlestick with 7 lamps, of course, a representation of the sun, the moon, and the 5 major planets on either side. The pillars of Jachim and Boaz, or Hakim and Boaz, I'm not sure, measured the pulse of the cosmos. They were so placed as to mark the furthest points of the sun's risings of the equinox of the, of the equinoxes. And according to the first century Jewish historian Josephus and Clement, the first bishop of Alexandria, they were topped with orreries, mechanical representations of the motions of the planets. Decorative carved pomegranates are mentioned several times in the biblical account. The robes of the priests were decorated with precious stones representing the sun, the moon, the planets, and the constellations, emeralds being the only stone named. The most extraordinary feature of the temple seems to have been a sea, or according to the Quran, a fountain of molten brass. Again, as with the bronze serpent nailed to a pole by Moses, this image of smelting should alert us to the presence of secret practices dedicated to transforming human physiology. Hiram, the master builder, employed a brotherhood of craftsmen to realize his designs. He classified them according to three grades: the apprentices, the companions, and the masters. Here we see ideas of fraternity that will eventually spread beyond the narrowly esoteric to transform the organization of society as a whole, and in the story of the murder of Hiram Abif, we see a warning of how it may all go wrong. Okay, almost at the end of this chapter. Got a little ways to go. This is a heavy text chapter. Usually there are more pictures. Um, There is an undercurrent of rivalry between Solomon and Hiram Abif in some of the secret traditions. The Queen of Sheba visited Solomon, but she was also curious to meet the man who had designed such a miraculous temple. And when she felt Hiram Abif's gaze on her, she experienced a sensation like molten metal inside. She asked Hiram how he had managed to bring the beauty of the heavens down to earth in the architecture of the temple. He responded by holding aloft a Tau cross, a cross in the shape of the letter T. Immediately, all the many workers swarmed into the temple like ants. Again, the image of the insect. There are traditions preserved in the Talmud and the Quran that the temple was built with the aid of a mysterious insect able to carve stone called the shamir. As with the image of the beehive, we have here an image of spiritual forces which Hiram is able to command. Okay, now we do have a picture, and the caption is Solomon's Temple in an 18th century print. The Freemasonic scholar Albert Pike called it an abridged image of the cosmos. The twin pillars, Hakim and Boaz, contain many layers of meaning, including, on a physiological level, the rhythmic motions of red and purple blood, and on a cosmic level, the spirit's rhythmic entry alternately into the spiritual and material worlds. Okay, so I'll show you that picture of the temple. So whether it actually looked like that or not, that's an 18th century person's rendition of it. What was it? Anyway, um, yeah, 18th century print. So, um, three of Hiram's workers were jealous of his secret powers. They decided they wanted to know the secrets of the molten sea. They ambushed him at the end of the day as he was leaving the temple. When he repeatedly refused to disclose his secrets, they murdered him, each dealing him a massive hemorrhage inducing blow to the head. It is said that certain secrets died with him and are still lost, that the secrets divulged in the mystery schools and secret societies ever since have been lesser secrets. There is a hint of a sexual element in the account of Sheba's burning sensation and the Tau cross, but to begin to understand Hiram's secrets, we must ask ourselves, given all the astronomical elements in the design and decorations of the temple, what was its particular orientation? Two independent-minded Masonic researchers, Christopher Knight and Robert Lomas, have worked out this orientation, starting from the clue that Hiram came from Phoenicia, where the principal deity was Astarte, or Venus. Of course, this ties in too with the decorative details already mentioned, the pomegranates, which are the fruit of Venus, and the emeralds, which are the precious stones of Venus. According to Clement of Alexandria, the curtain, which sectioned off the Holy of Holies, had cut into it the shape of a five-pointed star. The five-pointed star was has always been a symbol of Venus, because the pattern that Venus traces around the ecliptic in its 8-year cycle, 5 appearances in the morning sky and 5 in the evening sky, forms a five-pointed pattern. It is the only planet to draw a completely regular figure in this way. This figure is seen sometimes as a pentagram, sometimes as a five-pointed star, and sometimes, as we shall see when we come to investigate Rosicrucianism, as a five-petaled flower, the rose. By the way, I happen to have um, the Hiram Key, the Book of Hiram. Those are the books that are written by Christopher Knight and Robert Loma. So those are also on my list to read in this stream at some point. I've already read them, but it was a long, long time ago, and I'd like to reread them. So, anyway, as well as being a symbol of Venus, the pentagram is highly significant in geometry because, as Leonardo's mathematics teacher Luca Pacioli, Pacioli, Pacioli revealed in his book on divine proportion, it embodies the golden proportion in every part of it. But there is more. This sacred geometry operates in time as well as space. 5 Venus cycles of 584 days take place over exactly 8 solar years, which means that a Venus cycle is 1.6 of a solar cycle. We have come across this number 1.6 before. It is the beginning of the golden proportion, one of the irrational and magical numbers that describe the precipitation of mind into matter. In the ancient and secret doctrine, the planets and the stars control this precipitation of matter. The Venus associations multiply, one dimension opening up into another, like the bubble universes of modern science. There are many rival etymologies of the name Jerusalem, one being that the original name of the city was Urshalem, meaning founded by, and Shalem being an ancient name of Astarte, or Venus, in her evening setting. In Masonic tradition, its own lodges are modeled on the Jerusalem temple. The five-pointed star of Venus is represented above the ceremonial chair of the Grand Master, and initiates greet each other in a fraternal five-pointed ceremonial embrace. Lodges contain dormer windows aligned in such a way that the light of Venus shines through them on certain important days. A master mason is raised into rebirth facing the light of Venus at an equinox. What you talking about? I like that one. That's good. Um, so I don't know if you've listened to the earlier chapters of this yet, but the premise of this book is that matter did not come first. Mind came first, and then precipitated out of, or matter precipitated out of mind. So that's why he was talking earlier about the vegetable body and the material body, because the theory he's going by is that the like with say starting with Adam and Eve, that they were not fully material, fully human. They were actually more vegetable than animal, and that's how one could come from the other. I mean, the idea of taking Adam's rib and making Eve. he said it was really more of a what's the right term for plants that just split. I can't think of the term right now. There were probably 90% sun gazers, probably 500 calories a day. Yeah, maybe. But anyway, that's kind of where he's coming from, is that mind came first and then material came after, and as we've become more material, we've gotten farther from the divine. Let's see. As, whoa, whoa, whoa. Too fast for me to read here. As time windows winds down, we eat more and more matter. Yeah, we're 600 pounds. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, it does, actually. I'm an, a, I can attest to that. Um, I have to really watch my intake. Okay, where were we? Mind into matter. Okay. In the ancient and secret doctrine, the planets and the stars control this precipitation of matter. The Venus associations multiply, one dimension opening up into another, like the bubble universe of modern science. Oh, I already read this, didn't I? Because it gets into the Jerusalem temple and the light coming through the window at the equinox. Sorry. Um, so, the last couple of paragraphs of this chapter. Bearing in mind the identification of Venus with Lucifer, these associations might at first seem a bit disconcerting, but in esoteric history, Lucifer is always a necessary evil. The human capacity for thought was forged out of a balance between Venus and the moon, as we have seen, also features prominently in the design of the altar of the temple. The mission of Solomon was to lead humankind down into a darkening, more material world, keeping the flame of spirituality alive. It was the same mission that Freemasonry would take up in the 17th century at the dawn of the modern age of materialism. The Solomonic legends find a distant echo in the British Isles. Modern scholarship tends to hold the view that if the legends of Arthur have any historical basis at all, there lies in the Dark Ages. This lies in the Dark Ages, following the withdrawal of the Romans from Britain, when a Christian warlord might have fought glorious but ultimately futile battles to repel pagan invaders. An intriguing case has been made that the historical figure behind the Arthur legends was Owen Dantgwyn. I know I butchered that. A Welsh warlord who defeated the pagan Saxons at the Battle of Badon in 470. Arthur would in this case have been a title meaning the bear. But the original King Arthur lived at Tintagel a little earlier than Solomon in about 1100 BC, when the peaceful rural communities of Bronze Age Britain were overrun by the more militaristic hill fort people of the Iron Age. His spiritual mentor, Merlin, the Wizard of Celadon Wood, was a survivor from the age of the stone circles. He helped Arthur to keep the sun mysteries alive. King Arthur himself was a sun king, surrounded by the 12 knights of the zodiac and married to Venus, Guinevere being the Celtic form of Venere or Venus. His crown was a crown chakra ablaze to lead his people, as Solomon led his people down through the darkness. Okay. Hey, Vesper, how's it going? Thank you for coming in. I'm doing great. We're just finishing up the first chapter for the night. I've got a picture and a caption to read, and that finishes out the chapter, and then I'm going to jump into another one. So this picture, or the caption is, Herodotus recorded that in Iran, the king was believed to emit such an intense, unbearable light that he had to remain behind a curtain during audiences with his subjects. A crown was a symbol that a certain grade of initiation had been achieved, and that the initiate was crowned with Buddhic fire. Budic fire. That's interesting. I made that channel in Discord with all the links to the great courses. I saw that. I saw that. Yeah, Nambro's here. All right, let me show you this picture with the blazing coming off of the king. Um, there we go. This is what he was writing about in that caption. All right. Oops. And that is the end of that chapter. So that leads us into chapter 13, which is a shorter chapter, thankfully, because that last one was pretty heavy on the text, and I can feel my voice is not going to take another long chapter tonight. Maybe I need to medicate more. Um, so this is chapter 13, and again, like all the other chapters, it's a multi-part title for the chapter. So, reason and how to rise above it, Elijah and Elisha, or is that Elisha? I don't know. Isaiah is the second part. The third is esoteric Buddhism. Fourth is Pythagoras, and the fifth is Lao Tzu. You're on beer 5 or 6, 5 of 6. Medication mode maximized. Here, here. I got to work early in the morning, so I can only medicate with 2 of these. And this is the first one. Can't go into work smelling like whiskey. At least not anymore. I am sipping on a bourbon martini. Just cheap crap bourbon. Coors Country Beer. All right. Shall we get into the next chapter? Cheap is best. Well, especially if you're going to mix it. There's no sense in using the good stuff if you're mixing it, unless you're using Maker's Mark to do old fashions. Then there is nothing better. All right. After Solomon, the king of Israel, began to fall apart again. Let me reread that. That made no sense the way I read it. After Solomon, we would put a comma there maybe, but these English guys, they don't. The kingdom of Israel began to fall apart again. An institution grew up called the prophets. Their role was to advise the kings, except that, unlike the relationship between Melchizedek, I know I don't pronounce that right, and Abraham or Merlin and Arthur, theirs was adversarial, even subversive. They said uncomfortable and unpopular things no one wanted to hear. They ranted and raved. Sometimes they were thought of as mad. Elijah was a wild man, strange and solitary, almost like a tramp, with a leather belt and a long cloak. Like Zarathustra, he fought fire with fire. Solomon fell apart for real, though. Oh, yeah, yeah. Um, Told by God to hide in the wilderness and to drink from a brook, he was fed by ravens. Raven, quote unquote, indicates that Elijah has been initiated in the ways of the wisdom of Zarathustra. Raven, again, quote unquote, was one of the grades of initiation into his mysteries. The king of Israel, Ahab, married Jezebel and began to erect altars to Baal, the Canaanite name for Saturn/Satan. Elijah fought and won a battle with the prophets of Baal, calling fire down from heaven. Raven would be a great title for a book about such a subject. Yes, it would. calling down fire from heaven. On later occasions, he called fire down from heaven to kill squads of soldiers sent by Jezebel to capture him. Elijah was a man of blood and thunder, the prophet who lived closest to the borders of madness. There are stories of repeated, astonishing proofs of his charisma, his clairvoyance, his ability to turn a poisoned well wholesome, to make iron float, to heal a leper. There is a strange story of his bringing a young boy back to life by lying on top of him and infusing him with his spirit. I don't know, that sounds a little pedo to me. When he had to flee to the wilderness again, he was fleeing for his life and towards God. He found himself standing on a mountain in the middle of a terrible raging storm. We may imagine him railing against the storm, a combination of Lear and the Fool. Eventually, he sank down exhausted and slept under a juniper tree where he had a dream of an angel. Raven Child. I like Raven Child. That's pretty good. I might steal that name, or borrow it, or share it, whatever. He had the dream of an angel. Then, while it was still dark, he set off to climb Mount Horeb in search of God, as the angel had told him. But a great wind came, shaking the very mountain and sending enormous boulders bouncing down in his direction. Elijah knew that God was not in this wind, and he managed to reach the safety of a cave. Suddenly, a sheet of lightning struck the ground right in front of the cave, causing a roaring blaze in the vegetation outside, which trapped him inside. He also knew God was not in this fire. After a while, the storm and the fire died down, and as morning approached, all was calm. The morning star arose, and it was then, in the gentle morning air, that Elijah heard the still small voice of God. An exuberant, even outrageous figure, he was nevertheless the prophet of a new interiority. This is a development of Moses here. This is a development of Moses hearing of the voice in the burning bush, but quieter, subliminal almost. Where people had once had an overwhelming sense of the divine, now they would have to listen very intently, to practice mental discipline and directed attention in order to discern it. But in order to understand the true meaning of Elijah's mission, it is necessary to understand his death, and in order to do that, we will turn first to India. There are testimonies about Indian adepts able to dematerialize and materialize at will. In Paramhansa Yogananda's marvelous autobiography of a yogi, which I think I might have somewhere in my electronic files, first published in 1946, he describes how he was due to meet his spiritual master, Sri Yukteswar, at the local train station, but received a telepathic message not to go there. His master had been delayed. The pupil waited in the hotel. Suddenly, a window overlooking the street became brilliant with sunlight, and his master clearly materialized in front of him. His master explained that he was not an apparition but flesh and blood, that he had been divinely commanded to give his pupil this very rare experience. Paramhansa Yogananda touched the familiar sandals made of orange canvas and rolled with rope. He also felt the ochre cloth of his master's robe brush against him. Elijah developed this gift to the next stage. He learned how to excarnate and incarnate at will. You can't take it with you, goes the popular saying, but according to the secret doctrine, you can. The great 20th century initiate G.I. Gurdjieff said that exactly what is needed truly to become master of oneself in this life is what is needed to survive as a conscious being in the afterlife. Initiation is concerned at least as much with life after death as this life. In the 7th book of the Republic, Plato said, quote, "Those who are unable in the present life to apprehend the idea of the good will descend to Hades after death and fall asleep in its dark abode." End quote. At the end of his life, Elijah was carried up into the heavens in a fiery chariot. So, like Enoch and Noah before him, he did not die in the ordinary way. He joined the college of ascended masters, who are, for the most part, invisible but return to earth at times of great change and crisis. In Kabbalistic thought, the chariot by means of which Elijah ascends is called the Merkabah. Great initiates are able to work on the vegetable body so that it does not dissolve after death, enabling the ascending spirit to keep aspects of consciousness only usually possible during life on earth. Initiates know of secret techniques by means of which they very fine energies may be crystallized in such a way that they are not dispersed. We will see later that Christian thinkers would call this chariot the resurrection body, as ascended his mantle as Elijah ascended, his mantle slipped from him to be taken up by Elisha, is how I would pronounce that, whom Elijah had chosen as his successor. But I guess, is it Elisha? I don't know. Um, had chosen as his successor. By some mysterious process, the conferring of the mantle gives Elisha an increased portion of Elijah's power. We will return to look at the way this works when we come to consider the life and work of Shakespeare. The succession of Elijah by Elisha was not without ambiguity, though. Once Elijah seemed as if he might want to repudiate Elisha, he hurried off, and when Elisha caught up with him, said, quote, "Go back, what have I done to you?" End quote. Does he see something in Elisha he is not sure of? Later, I think that's actually how it's pronounced. Elisha is mocked for being bald by a large gang of boys and uses his power to call two bears from the woods which attack and kill them. I think we're supposed to be in an ad, but I don't see one starting, so I'm going to finish this paragraph. Except that I lost my place because I'm a dumbass. Go back. Oh. Mocked for being bald by a gang of boys, and uses his power to call two bears from the woods which attack and kill them. It is as if the prophet is still engaged in a deadly battle with Baal. Okay, and now I do see we are in an ad. I don't know who all is seeing it. If you're um, subscribed, you're probably not. But for anybody that's not, I will go ahead and wait until OBS says we're done with the ad, which is just now. All right, so let me read that last sentence one more time. Later, Elisha is mocked for being bald by a large gang of boys and uses his power to call two bears from the woods which attack and kill them. It is as if the prophet is still engaged in a deadly battle with Baal. 200 years later, by the time of the later prophets, a new transcendent understanding of the way the universe works had developed. The concept of grace put prophets on a much less warlike footing. In 550 BC, Isaiah proclaimed, quote, "The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." End quote. Okay, and then we have a picture here. Elijah ascends, print from a 19th century Bible. So Elijah ascends. So he's in this chariot. Looks like a single horse, maybe two horses. It's hard to tell. And I would assume this is Elisha down here with Elijah in the chariot. Anyway, I know I mispronounce a lot of stuff, but that's just the way it is. The concept of grace grew out of this prophetic sense of history. The kings of the two kingdoms and their peoples failed to do what was asked of them. They degenerated and the land was laid waste. But then, because of the grace of God, a living root emerged from the wasteland. The prophets saw grace operating in this way in their own lifetimes, on a military and political level, in the rise and fall and rise again of their own little kingdoms. They also prophesied its repetition in the greater cosmic cycles of history. Sorry. For the followers of Baal, on the other hand, life was about the exercise of power. They believed that if they performed the correct religious practices, sacrifices, and magical ceremonies, they could compel their gods to do their bidding. Isaiah repudiated this view. He told his people that Yahweh had shown them grace by choosing them, by empowering them to obey, by purging them of their sins, by saving them when they had been stiff-necked and disobeyed, and by the promise of restoring them to former glory even though they did not deserve it. Yahweh's gracious love could never be demanded, bought, or earned, he said. It is a love given in complete freedom. I think a few priests nowadays need to remember that. Once this kind of divine love had been understood, it would only be a matter of time before this understanding opened a new dimension in the love of one human for another. Isaiah had a great sense of both the history and the future fortunes of Israel. Quote, "There shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse," is what it looks like to me. I don't know. End quote. He also has a great vision of the end of history, which we will return to later. Quote, "The wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid." End quote. The prophetic tradition would die out by about 450 BC, as the Kabbalist Rabbi Chaim Vital would write at the end of the 16th century after Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Prophets were only able to see into the lowest levels of the heavens, and then only in a heavily shrouded way. Hi, nice reading. The shape of the Merkaba. You're asking something that's a bit beyond me, but I'm sure we can look it up. But not in the middle of the reading. Um, but yeah, you're asking something that's a bit beyond my knowledge. Thank you for asking, though. I always appreciate questions, even if I can't answer them. The last words in the Old Testament are the ringing words of Malachi, prophesying Elijah's return, and today this is still looked forward to every year at Passover, when a place is laid for him at dinner with a cup of wine and the door left open. But in different parts of the world, other remarkable initiates were opening up. Start that sentence again, sorry. But in different parts of the world, other remarkable initiates were opening up other new dimensions in the human condition. A great spirit of enlightenment was weaving through several different minds and several different cultures at the same time. Since Prince Siddhartha was born into a time and place characterized by small warring states in Lumbini in modern-day Nepal. So we're talking about Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, the founder of Buddhism. Until the age of 29, he lived in pampered luxury. His every need was met before it began to tug on him, and his ever Every vista was a delight. Then one day he left the royal palace and saw something he had never been allowed to see, an old man. He was horrified, but he looked further, discovering that his own people were ill and dying. He decided to leave the palace and his wife and child in order to try to make sense of this suffering. Living among ascetics for 7 years, he failed to find what he was looking for in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and the teachings of the descendants of the rishis. Then finally, when he was 35, he went and sat under a Bodhi tree on the banks of the river Naranjara, determined not to move until he understood. After 3 days and 3 nights, he realized that life is suffering, that suffering is caused by desire for earthly things, but that you can achieve freedom from all desire. Indeed, you can achieve such freedom and such affinity for the spirit world that you need never reincarnate again, and so you may become, as Siddhartha did, a Buddha. The path to understanding or enlightenment was called by the Buddha the Eightfold Path, which involved right belief, right conviction, teaching, action, living, intention, thinking, contemplation, along with the Four Noble Truths. The Eightfold Path may seem impossibly high minded, moralizing to modern Western sensibility. It may also seem a bit abstract, even impractical, but the teachings of the Buddha have an esoteric side, and like all esoteric teachings, they have a layer of meaning which is eminently practical. Esoteric philosophy teaches its initiates how to achieve psychological transformation using practical techniques to manipulate human physiology. In the case of Buddha's Eightfold Path, these 8 practices are exercises for enlivening 8 of the 16 petals of the throat chakra. This represents a historic change in initiatic practice. In the initiation rituals practiced in the Great Pyramid, for example, the candidate had been sent into a deep death-like trance. Then a circle of 5 initiates had raised his vegetable body out of his physical body. They had worked on it, molding it, coaxing it into forms capable of perceiving higher worlds, so that when the vegetable body sank again into the physical body, and the candidate reawoke, he was born into a new, higher form of life. The point is that the candidate was unconscious throughout this process. Now, the followers of Buddha consciously participated in their own initiation, consciously working on their own chakras. Part of this work was living a new, more moral way of life, based on compassion for all living things. Because people were growing increasingly independent of the spirit worlds, there was a danger that an individual's power would outstrip his desire to do the right thing and use them wisely. There was also a danger that the evil-minded might gain the supernatural powers that initiation confers. It has also always been possible for people to gain these powers even though they have not been initiated. Sometimes it happens as a result of extreme childhood trauma. This can cause a rent in the psyche through which spirits rush in an uncontrolled way. Some modern mediums have suffered great childhood traumas. Sometimes people acquire powers through the practice of a magic which is either black or at least not attuned to the highest spiritual aims, as it is in the venerable secret schools which keep alive a genuine ancient tradition. The danger in all this is that a non-initiate, even a well-intentioned one, may have difficulty recognizing the spirits he or she is communicating with. Okay, and then we have a picture. The caption is, in esoteric Buddhism, the Buddha is the spirit of Mercury. It is not coincidence, then, that the Celts called the planet Mercury Bud, meaning wise teacher, wise teaching. That the lotus position, characteristic of the Buddha, was known to the Celts is proved by this carving on a bucket found in Usberg, Norway. So let me show you that. The Celts were a lot wider spread than people think. When we think of Celts now, we think British Isles, but the Celts actually ranged all the way through Europe. Um, they basically had sort of a loose kingdom of their own that was huge. Anyway, showing you the picture. So it also looks like we've got some very old versions of the swastika, which, if you've watched others um, videos from this particular book, I have already mentioned it's a very, very ancient symbol, if you don't know, that's been around for thousands of years. So it's not this terrible, evil Nazi thing. They just took it and tried to use it for their own, and now everybody thinks that's all it is. Anyway, moving on. The aim of the Eightfold Path is initiation as part of a controlled and protecting moral development. If you are able to control the world, you must first be able to exercise control over yourself. That is very reminiscent of Jordan Peterson's before you go out and try to change the world, clean your room. um, Probably where he got it. The throat chakra is the organ of the formulation of spiritual wisdom. It connects the heart chakra with the brow chakra. In the physiology of an initiate, currents of love stream up from the heart chakra through the throat chakra to light up the brow chakra. When this light streams up onto the brow chakra, it opens up like a flower in the sun. We may all catch an echo or foretaste of this in our own lives. If we look at someone with the eyes of love, we see good qualities not perceptible to others. Just the act of looking at someone lovingly may also bring out these qualities and help them to blossom. If you meet someone with an extremely refined spiritual nature, he or she will probably be happy, smiling, laughing, almost childlike. This is because they look at the whole of humanity with the eye of love. Interesting, you said. Not sure what you're referring to. Was it my thing on? I know there's a delay here, so I'm not sure you're referring to something I experienced a minute or so ago. Um, when the Buddha died, he had achieved this aim. He would not be required to reincarnate. But this is not to say he is no longer a part of this history, as we see when we come to look at the Italian Renaissance. And really, and actually a side note on that, that's what bodhisattvas are, is they are people that have reached enlightenment and don't need to reincarnate, but they choose to. So basically, they take upon themselves a small flaw that causes them to reincarnate so that they can come back and help other people reach that state. Okay, we have another picture. Let me read the caption. The Buddhist Emperor Asoka, grandson of the first man to unify India, ruled from 273 BC. When he lost more than 100,000 men in a battle, he renounced war, and from then on tried to rule by the shining example of his Buddhist spirituality. He had some 84,000 stupas or shrines erected in India, of which a handful survive. In conventional history, he is remembered for his irrigation, roads, hospitals, and botanical gardens, his vegetarianism, and ban on the killing of animals. In esoteric history, he is remembered too for having founded the Nine Unknown, a powerful secret society that many in the 20th century, including D.N. Bose, one of India's leading scientists, believed still operated. What that has to do with this picture, I don't know, other than it's a temple. Don't know. So I'll show you that real quick. I'm assuming this is an example of one of the temples he had erected. I guess it could be, but did they even understand that when the Star of David was created? You two talk about amongst yourselves on that. I think I'm following what you're talking about, but I want to concentrate on reading. Pythagoras was born on the prosperous Greek island of Samos in about 575 BC, as the first blocks of marble were being placed one on top of the other on the Acropolis in Athens. No individual has had a greater influence on the evolution of Western esoteric thought. Pythagoras was regarded as a demigod during his lifetime. Like Jesus Christ, nothing he wrote has come down to us, only a few collected sayings and commentaries and stories written by disciples. It is said that he had the power of being in two places at the same time, that a white eagle had permitted him to stroke it, that he once addressed a river god and a voice called out to him from the water, I greet thee, Pythagoras. It is also said that he once told some fishermen who had been having an unproductive day to cast their nets into the sea one last time, whereupon their catch almost burst their nets. He was a great healer, sometimes reciting particular verses from Homer he believed had great power, just as Christian mystics will recite verses from the Psalms and John's Gospel. He used music for healing purposes too. The early Greek philosopher Empedocles said Pythagoras could heal the sick and rejuvenate the old. Like the Buddha, he could remember his past incarnations, and it was even said that he could recall the entire history of the world from the beginning. His wisdom was the results of years of research and multiple initiations into mystery schools. He spent 22 years learning the secrets of the Egyptian initiate priests. He also studied with the Magi in Babylon and the descendants of the rishis in India, where a memory was preserved of the great wonder worker they called Yavancharya. Yavancharya. Pythagoras was seeking the to Pythagoras was seeking to synthesize esoteric thought from all around the world into a comprehensive cosmoconception, what Leibniz, the 17th century mathematician and Kabbalist, would later call the perennial philosophy. At this point in the history of the world, according to idealism, we have reached a turning point. The great ideas of thoughts emanating from the cosmic mind are now almost hidden by the matter they have worked together to create. The mission of Pythagoras was to record them as concepts before they disappeared entirely. Pythagoras' philosophy, therefore, begins the process of translating the primordial vision, the picture consciousness of ancient humanity, into abstract conceptual terms. In about 532, Pythagoras fell foul of Polycrates. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. The despotic ruler of Samos. Forced into exile, he set up a small community, the first of several, in Crotona in southern Italy. Candidates for initiation into his community had to undergo years of training, including a strange diet that included poppy, sesame, and cucumber seeds, wild honey, daffodil flowers, and the skin of sea onion from which the juice had been completely extracted. There was great emphasis on gymnastics as a way of bringing the three human bodies, material, vegetable, and animal, into harmony, and candidates were required to remain silent for years on end. Pythagoras was able to grant his pupils a great vision of the spirit worlds, which he would then interpret for them. Out of this, the first discursive teaching would emerge. Out of this, the first discursive teaching would emerge mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and music. In his day, Pythagoras was said to be the only human being able to hear the music of the spheres, conceived as a scale of different notes, each made by the 7 planets as they moved through space. This is easy to dismiss as mystical hogwash, but the story of how he measured the first musical scale has an authentic sounding ring to it. One day, Pythagoras was walking through town when he heard metal being pounded on an anvil. He noticed that different size hammers made different sounds. Returning home, he fixed a plank of wood across a room and hung a series of weights according to the weights of the different hammers in an ascending scale. By a process of trial and error, he determined that the musical notes that sound beautiful to the human ear correspond to different weights. He then calculated that they were proportionate to one another in a mathematically precise way. It is from these calculations by Pythagoras that we derive the musical octave we understand and enjoy today. As Pythagoras and his followers began to describe the national element the rational element in life, they parted. I must be getting tired. I'm screwing up a lot. As Pythagoras and his followers began to describe the rational element in life, they started to formulate a parallel concept. It was a concept which had perhaps never been articulated before, because up till that point it had been a part of everyone's everyday experience. The concept went like this: life can be explained in rational terms only up to a point. There is a vast irrational element in life, too. The teachings of the mystery schools relating to the rational side would help build cities, develop science and technology, structure and regulate the outworld. The irrational teaching in its explicit form would be confined to the schools. To talk about it outside was dangerous and might well attract hostility. As Plutarch would put it, quote, "One who knows the higher truths finds the serious values of society difficult to take seriously. Eternity is a child at play." End quote. Okay, last 2 pages. Here at the birth of rational thought, the mystery schools nurtured its opposite. It is no accident that individuals like Pythagoras, Newton, and Leibniz, those who had done most to help humanity get to grips with the reality of the physical universe, have also been deeply immersed in esoteric thought. This is because it is undoubtedly true, as these great minds have seen, that if you look at life as subjectively as possible rather than objectively, as you must do in science, some very different patterns emerge. Life viewed objectively may be rational and subject to natural law, but experienced subjectively it is irrational. But by consciously splitting experience in this way, Pythagoras made it possible to think more clearly about both dimensions. The pupils of Pythagoras were taught to live apart from society, alternating between mystical ecstasy and intellectual analysis. Pythagoras was the first to call himself a lover of wisdom, that is to say, a philosopher. But like Socrates and Plato, who followed him, he was closer to a magus than a modern-day university professor. His pupils were in awe of him. They believed he had the power to make them dream what he willed, and that he could reorient their waking consciousness in an instant, too. Pythagoras attracted murderous rage from those excluded from his inner circle. He refused to admit a man called Chiron, I know it's Cyron, stirred up, refused to admit him into his mystery school because of his reckless, imperious behavior. Chiron, I'll say, stirred up a mob against Pythagoras. They broke into the building where Pythagoras and his followers were meeting and set fire to it. Everyone inside died. In the era of Pythagoras, 2 other philosophers on different sides of the world, Heraclitus in Greece and Lao Tzu in China, briefly came to the surface of history, trying to define rationally and irrational dimension, trying to define rationally the irrational dimension of life. "We cannot step in the same stream twice," said Heraclitus. "There is a story that Confucius went to see Lao Tzu and asked to be initiated. Lao Tzu turned him away, mocking him for his mixture of ingratiating manners and vaulting ambition. It is probably apocryphal, but it points to an important truth which is that Confucianism and Taoism represent exoteric and esoteric thought in China. And Lao Tzu probably didn't exist, by the way. He's an amalgamation of people. Um, the Chinese have a tendency to do that in their history. They will take several historical figures that are kind of so, not super important, but they did important things, and they'll just combine them all into one godlike person. Confucius spent years collecting traditional Chinese wisdom, and these collections would be adopted as manuals for government by later Chinese leaders. The sayings of Confucius are eminently reasonable. A 1,000-mile journey begins with a single step. Value the task more than the prize. If you can't meet your goals, adjust your goals, and so on. We can compare Confucius with Rudyard Kipling. They were both servants of empire. If scientific materialism described everything there is in life, Kipling's poem If would be the last word on the conduct of life, and esoteric philosophy would have nothing to teach us. And it looks like at least part of this poem is here. I've never read it. So, quote, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that is in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. End quote. The problem is that though there may be times when the best thing to do is to try with all our might and not give up, there are other times, as Orpheus had found to his cost, when it is prudent to give up and go with the flow. Sometimes when you grab at what you want, you just push it further away. Sometimes the only way to keep something is by letting it go. As Lao Tzu says, quote, because the awakened one puts himself behind, he steps ahead. Because he gives way, he gains. Because he is selfless, he fulfills himself. The still is the lord of the restless, end quote. And that's actually a very Chinese thing, too, when it comes to things like Tai Chi, where there's a story about a guy goes to a master and says and wants to train with him, and he says, "What if I train, you know, an hour every day? How long will it take me to master this?" And he says, "Oh, 5 years." Well, what if I train 5 hours a day? Oh, at least 10 years. Well, what if I train 12 hours a day? Oh, at least 20 years. And the whole idea is by grabbing onto it so hard, you're actually pushing it away. Same thing. Okay. Last two paragraphs. 30 years after the death of Pythagoras, an enormous Persian army under Xerxes swept over Greece. Then, in the early years of the 5th century BC, Persian forces were defeated and driven back by the Athenians at Marathon, and then by the Athenian-Spartan alliance at Mycale. Pythagoras, I know I've seen that, but I've never heard it spoken. Pythagoras had institutionalized the open discussion of options and the making of collective decisions on matters which concerned the whole community. What we today call politics, from this and in the space created by the Athenian-Spartan alliance, would emerge the unique character of the Greek city-state of Athens. And that is the end of the chapter. Okay, so that leads us up to chapter 14, and I'll read off the title because I always do. The Mysteries of Greece and Rome, the Eleusinian Mysteries, Socrates and his daemon, Plato as a magus, the divine identity of Alexander the Great, the Caesars and Cicero, and the rise of the Magi. Those are all the different things he'll cover in the next chapter, which is going to be 26 pages. So, let's see who we've got around to raid. If you'll please just give whoever we go to 5 minutes of your time. I always like to raid somebody if I can. So let's see who we've got around that could use the viewers. Wow, I'm not really seeing anybody that is. I haven't been bothering to go to Ren Flames or Alyosha. They only ever have one person, one viewer, um, and they are on this always on thing where they're just showing repeating clips. So I haven't been going to them. So you know what? I have not been over to see Quincy's Tavern in quite a long time. So I'm going to go over there, even though he really doesn't need my viewers. I'm still going to go over there. So give him a couple minutes of your time. Say hi if you want, and I will take us over there. See you there in just a minute. Just bear with me.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes.
He's not even coming up on my list.
Wonder where I might find some
well, you know what? Then in
peace
that case,
of mind.
we just won't.
Not my talk I've had, but more
Sorry. We'll just call it there. Have a good night.